Justify. Prove to be right or reasonable. Justification is at the heart of all legal and political argument. But at a time when argument itself is slave to appearances, it is time to bring back a culture of justification. Justify, a podcast on law and politics in India from the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, hosted by Arghya Sengupta.
Hello and welcome again to Justify. In this episode, we are going to be discussing the role of religion in the Indian Constitution. Our point of departure is going to be the judgment of the Karnataka High Court, which upheld the Karnataka government's decision to disallow the wearing of the hijab by Muslim girl students in college classrooms. While a lot has been written about the judgment itself, both for it as well as against it, I think the judgment provides a great point of departure to discuss what exactly does religion mean in the Constitution of India, and more generally, what is the role of religion in public life in India? Does being secular necessarily mean that we are irreligious? To discuss these issues, I'm delighted to have my friend Raag Yadava, who's an assistant professor at the National Law School, Bangalore, and with whom I've written an article on the hijab judgment called Have Faith, Be Liberal. So you can look at that article to understand what's going to come in the next 40 minutes, though I hope that this will be a more fleshed out version of what we could write in 800 words. Raag, welcome to Justify.
Thanks for having me, Argo.
So Raag, this is very different from the discussion that we had last time. I remember last time we were discussing legal education, but in some senses, it's also very similar. Because of the fact that when we think about the role of religion in our lives and in some sense in our education system, there is this commonly perceived notion, and we've been discussing this earlier, that we don't want to think of questions of religion necessarily as part of an educational curriculum, because we tend to think that it's associated with ritualistic mumbo jumbo, that it's kind of ascetic philosophies and very otherworldly in nature. So, what exactly, in your view, is the understanding that we have commonly about religion in our lives? I know that's an open-ended question, but I think that's a good place to start.
So, Argo, actually, I'm maybe if I start with education, which is perhaps the thing that I'm involved in daily, and that concerns the hijab case as well, and take off from there. So I think when we talk about religion and politics, we've spoken a lot about politics, but we need to speak a little bit more about understanding what exactly religion can mean, because there are all sorts of different understandings of religion that are usually clubbed together. And in my understanding, when I look at those different things that we bracket under religion, they're not necessarily all the same thing. So just to give you an example, in my teaching experience with students over the last couple of years, I was thinking, and I could think about three kinds of responses that I usually got when I spoke to my students about religion or when I thought of it myself. So the first kind of answer that I usually get from students is a general aversion to anything religious or spiritual, speaking about Indic or Hindu thought, and there is a debate about which word you use. There is some kind of inherited dislike for these kinds of terms, and it comes from many different places, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. So one group of people see it, like you said, as abstruse, polysyllabic metaphysics, meant only for some committed philosophers sitting somewhere in a cave or in their study, and it's not particularly useful for a modern society. So this is that debate between religion and modernity, and must we, as we become more modern and more progressive, must we abandon religion? And then if we abandon it, what else do we use as a source of values and norms? So that's one kind of response I get. The second kind of response that I get is, and this is prevalent and not without reason, is religion is especially associated with its more crude forms. When we speak of Hinduism, it is often associated with, sometimes even seen as coexistent with the caste system. When we speak of Islam, when I speak informally with my students, is often associated with regressive practices found in some communities. So there is a sense that religion is kind of like, an atavistic drag on our past, something that we can tolerate till we have to maintain some kind of social harmony, and that's about it. But it's not really something that provides you with a sense of value. And the third is religion that is associated with a certain political outlook on the world. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon because you can see religion as philosophy, and I'll just say a quick word about that. But often religion is seen today, because we're in very fractious times, as kind of like a proxy battleground for what political ideology you hold. And often when we discuss religion, one gets this sense that you're actually trying to discuss politics in a disguised way. So these are the three kinds of general aversions.
If I were to stop you for a moment, and if I were to think about one common thread that runs through each of these three different types of aversions that you've noted, it seems to be that religion is somewhere understood as organized religion. Organized religion is what drives some political movements, not just in India but elsewhere. In India, of course, there's a big question mark as to whether Hindutva as a philosophy has anything to do with the Hindu religion. Savarkar would perhaps say no to that, but that's a different debate. Let's get to that later. But the politics of religion has to do with organized religion. The fact that it's a drag in some senses, as in these practices that are there, are also practices that are part of an organized religious community. And some part of the first point, though not entirely, which is the part that makes religion seem like ritual and ceremony, and whether it is in Sanskrit or some other language that most people don't understand, it all seems to point to a certain kind of organized way of thinking about certain things. And it's more about the organization than about the thought. So do you think that there's something there about separating religion, if there is something really called religion simpliciter, from its organized form, which is leading to these aversions?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, because in my understanding of religion, both as an academic and as someone who practices religion, the organized form of religion actually is, if you look, just at the philosophical literature, you will find references after references across traditions. I was recently reading Kabir's poetry. If you read Radhakrishnan, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, Gandhiji also to a certain extent, you will constantly find this refrain that the true religion, the deeper core of religion, is not about any organized setup regulated by some imposed scripture. It's not about any groupism or identity. It's rather a way of inquiry, of seeking into the deeper law of your own being. It's a form of scientific experimentation with a scientific temper into the deeper truths of your existence. Now, one can obviously understand it at different levels. We may engage in very detailed debates about the ultimate natures of reality and what is the correct ontology and so on. Or we may also look at it for ethical principles and morals by which we can develop a better, freer, nobler life. That's the kind of religion that I find when I go back to the scripture that I am familiar with, and when I read the best commentators that we have. Now, it's in fact this distinction that I think is very important in separating the true religion from the kind of religion that I just noted people are averse to. Those three aversions that I noted, I don't think are without reason. But what ends up happening usually is that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we tend to think that all religion looks like this organized kind of religion. It's usually some creed, some dogmatic understanding of things. It's about beliefs and superstitions and unthought out practices. But the core of religion actually is not that. The core of religion is a radical individual seeking for knowledge, which is not based on belief or blind faith, but is based ultimately on experimentation and experience. Right? And that's the core of, at least in my understanding, of the Indic religion. So if one were to ask the question, if one reads Swami Vivekananda or Sri Aurobindo, and one asks the question, do you believe in X, Y, or Z practice? in my view, one would likely get the answer that the question is not about belief. The question is about whether you have investigated, experimented, read, and discovered the truth for yourself. And that kind of religion, I think, actually is, the more I speak with students, and once we get past this crust of religious aversion, there is an opening. They find it exciting. They at least find it interesting enough to pursue further. And that kind of religion is not only compatible, I think, with being secular or with having a sense of individual liberty, but in fact is one of the deepest groundings for it. And so I think this is what has led Radhakrishnan and Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo to base their understandings on liberalism by drawing on these deeper moral and cultural resources. So I think that's where the debate has to lie.
No, so I think that there's a lot to unpack there, but if you were to try and take it strand by strand and without getting into the questions around secularism or constitutional secularism at this point of time. Let's first take this point which you said is the core of religion, which is an act of seeking. Seeking for knowledge, perhaps with the ultimate aim of seeking for truth. And I think there can be no cavil about the fact that that is what the core of an understanding of religion is, irrespective of what texts you use in order to help you in that path. But there seems to be, when you said that, you said something that was interesting, which you said that there is almost a scientific temper in that approach. That approach is almost, when you were speaking, it seemed a bit like scientific experimentation, that you're doing something, you have a question, you're trying something out, you're seeing whether it's working. If it's working, then great. If it's not working, then you're trying something else. But this goes contrary to currently dominant understandings of religion being antithetical to science. That it is not based on method, it is not based on rigor. It is based on a certain kind of experience that is at its core individual, and so cannot easily be proved in a register that we understand. So how would you respond to that? Is religion like science, or is religion unlike it, or is this framing incorrect?
I think that's a very deep and philosophical question. And if I just take a step back, I think if we start asking that question, we've already taken one step away from the kind of dogmatic, organized religion that we're speaking about. So if our public dialogue were happening in this domain right now, I think we would already be much better off. So that's just a sort of background point. I mean, on this issue, this has been an interesting debate that has been happening between science and spirituality as to whether there is any validity to religious experience and so on and so forth. If I were to just put it in two simple propositions, although they will be quite broad, the first is, I think science has rightly attacked one kind of religion which is not sufficiently seeking and which bases itself on some kind of unreasoned authority of some scripture or of some set of canonical beliefs. And in doing that, science has, and atheism in general, has done a great service to push those with belief, push those with faith, to reason out their understandings a bit more. But where science, in my view, and I'm almost quoting Swami Vivekananda on this, where science has perhaps exceeded its mandate is in thinking that the scientific method of external observation, the way of the natural sciences, can yield truths about questions of value rather than just questions of what exists and the mechanics of existence. Not that, but the questions of what is the meaning of existence and so on and so forth. In those questions of value, science has come up against a hard wall. Now, that is not a criticism of scientists. That's just, in my view, an understanding of the limitations of the scientific method. And I think this is why today we see, with a number of different debates, both in the academic domain, in the popular domain, in the scientific domain, we see greater dialogue, mutual respectful dialogue between science and spirituality. So you have, popular initiatives like the Dalai Lama's center for research into neuroscience research into contemplative practices. You have the very famous problem in philosophy called the hard problem of consciousness. And that is yielding some wonderful literature, which is demonstrating how some spiritual truths embodied in different scriptural traditions, especially Vedanta, which I'm more familiar with, are actually deeply compatible with scientific discoveries that are being made. Now, that's, I think, the avant-garde of the of scientific study. I'll just make one distinction here between a scientific temper, which our constitution requires us to have, and the scientific method of the natural sciences. So religion, I think, has the former, as does science. But to think that the scientific method of the natural sciences is the only way of going about accessing the truth of things, accessing the meaning and value of our life, I think is a contested proposition. And there is a lot of debate.
Just sort of thinking even within the framework of religion, as if you were to think about paths to moksha in Indic thought, as in there is no one path, right? As in you have karma yoga, bhakti yoga, gyan yoga, raj yoga, now kriya yoga. There are multiple paths to attaining knowledge, and these paths are very distinct from each other. And some may find their path in bhakti, and someone else may find it in jnana. And part of jnana, I've always felt that part of jnana could be, in some sense, some kind of method that is analogous to a scientific method, because at the end of the day it's trying to seek enlightenment through knowledge rather than through action or devotion. Okay, and so it seems to me that all of what Indic religion seems to suggest is that there is no one way, right? There is no one way to achieving this, and that is a experimented experience, which is something that is compatible with not just the scientific temper, but perhaps even the scientific method.
I think that's absolutely right. So Sri Ramakrishna, very famously said, it's in Bengali. I'm with you, so I'm not going to say the original Bengali. He said, "Infinite paths to infinite reality." And
Joto
then,
path, tato path.
absolutely, I'm glad I didn't say it.
Yeah.
And there is a wonderful book, actually, for those who are interested, by Swami Medhananda, which is entitled "Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality," which actually goes into detail into this question. And the very idea behind this kind of sort of infinite existence is that there is a unique path to self-discovery for each individual. And obviously one can take, one is not constrained by any scripture from any domain. And our greatest sages and saints would have said this quite explicitly. But at the same time, and I think this brings us to a political question, is it is useful to have a cultural space, a cultural background, which facilitates, promotes, and encourages this kind of self-seeking. Now, one can always say, do this privately, do this in your home, and that's absolutely right. Ultimately, this is an individual journey that one has to make, and one may make friends and along the way and create a community. But to ignore the cultural dimensions of this kind of a collective religious seeking in a syncretic way, in a way where you can have multiple identities and where you are finding the law of your own truth in this scientific way, is, I think, very important. And that is actually what I see as the cultural importance of religion in India. Not the organized religion or group identities, which can be protected under the constitution. They have their way, they have their place. But also this other dialogue about the public sphere being a place which can promote, which can help, which can make you feel comfortable in this kind of seeking and push you along the way a little bit, right? That cultural space, which is, I think, a neutral, central cultural space, is where I think questions of science and the method of religion intersect with the questions of politics and culture. And that's where we have to, I think, do some very careful thinking so that we don't fall prey to the kind of labeling and the fairly fractious kind of debate we have today.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the effects of understanding ourselves as a secular country has been the fact that we think that religion is a private matter. Now, at its core, it's true that this kind of self-seeking is an intensely individual activity, as in then people can find their various paths, and there's no doubt about that. But there is this allied question of, does the fact that religion is a private activity mean necessarily that there is no religion in the public sphere? And I think this gets us into the hijab judgment, and what the hijab judgment was also trying to do is it's trying in some sense, not just in saying that the hijab is not allowed, but it goes further. It's leveling down kind of argument to say saffron shawls are not allowed, to say that we don't want any overt representations of religion in the public sphere itself. Now, keeping aside the question of organized religion, and I think that we've dealt with, Rag, I wanted to understand from you, what is your sense of the role of religion, which is, as we agree, an intensely private activity in the public sphere, and we can limit it to India or take it as a conceptual matter.
So I think there are two questions here. One is a political question and the second is a cultural question. And I think you will be able to speak better on the political or constitutional question. So I'll focus on the second. Now, what do I mean by a cultural question? So one can say that we have to be politically secular, which is a fairly uncontroversial proposition, in that the state should not discriminate anyone on the grounds of religion. The state should not have its own religion and impose it on anyone else. And it should allow individuals the space, the privacy, and the freedom to follow whatever practice and way and method they want to, whether it's religious or otherwise. That, if I take those as the basic pillars of a political secularism, that's fine. Where I think things become interesting and where there is debate to be had is when we think that political secularism implies cultural secularism. Now, cultural secularism is the idea that as we become more progressive, more modern, the public sphere will necessarily see a decline of religion. And it will not be that kind of overarching presence that we have seen where people draw values from it, where it is, to use a slightly loaded term, the normative umbrella that regulates our public activities. Now, the second idea, I don't see in the Constitution. I don't see anything in the Constitution going one way or the other, but that seems to have been an obvious proposition that has been taken to be true in many debates, but I think that needs to be questioned a little bit more. Just a background on this. So I think the roots of this traces to what is actually called the secularization thesis. And this was
Charles Taylor.
Precisely. So Charles Taylor has written a wonderful book called The Secular Age, which is about Western secularity. But I think it has many learnings for us here also. So drawing from people like John Stuart Mill, Auguste Comte, Hume, and so on and so forth, there was this idea that there is this progression of society that, and one can understand why in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this would have been a very palatable view and a very interesting view, that as science is taking over more and more ground, we will become rational, we will discover truths simply through by dint of our reasoning rather than having to deny on any scripture, and so on and so forth. Now, in part, the secularization thesis is true, like I said, because our rational speculations, our insistence on evidence, our insistence on experimentation has meant that any religious belief which has elements of superstition or blind faith or devotion has now been questioned and put to the test. But in academic literature today, there is, I think, quite some evidence to say that the secularization thesis has not worked out in the way we thought we would, because religion has not declined. If anything, religion has seen a resurfacing in the last couple of decades. And what we need to now consider is not how soon will we leave religion behind, but rather how do we engage in a conversation between religion and secularism. Now,
when you say religion has resurfaced, do you mean to say political religion? Because, or are you making an empirical claim?
So this is an interesting question. So let me just offer some. There were a couple of studies where people were asked, are you religious today? Now, usually what that meant was, do you call yourself a Hindu? Do you call yourself a Muslim? Do you believe in the authority of X or Y text? Or do you go to church? Now, there is not as much empirical evidence on this as I would like to make a universal claim. But what it indicates is that more people are saying that they are less religious, but more spiritual. Now, they may not have some grand understanding of what spiritual means as a whole category, but people seem to be rejecting that kind of organized religion based on blind faith and wanting more and more to develop their own unique understandings of the world and so on and so forth. So I mean religion, not in the
This is
organized
actually
sense,
quite
but
interesting. Sorry, if you were to take a slight aside, given that you said this, this is a line that I used to, when I was asked this question, sometimes when I was in college, I used to have this stock response that, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And now that you say it, I think what was going on in my head, and I don't know whether this is the case there in the respondents, but what was going on in my head is that there are several facets of organized religion that I don't like. I don't like, and this is not just about the Hindu religion, but I don't like the fact that there are ceremonies which are conducted in Sanskrit that I don't understand 90% of. I don't like the fact that I don't like the fact that religion is used as a tool for political mobilization. Okay, so there are certain facets of organized religion that I don't like. But I also wanted to contest the notion that this is all that religion is, because religion always to me has been the 2 minutes of quiet in the morning, every morning, where I sit down and think of nothing, or try to think of nothing, and tell myself that thinking of saying that you're thinking of nothing is also thinking of something, so try and think of nothing. So I mean, it's in those moments, in those silences, where we try and find our inner selves, without trying to make a sort of too loaded a claim. But I think that this statement that we're not religious but we're spiritual is perhaps, for me at least, as I thought, I'll just share this as an aside, there's no question here, but was essentially a repudiation of organized religion, and perhaps a reaffirmation of the fact that religion is far too precious to be thrown out with the bathwater.
I think that I mean, if I also take a quick biographical detour. So I grew up in a family which went to the Arya Samaj. And so my grandmother would take us every Sunday, and on every important occasion, someone from the Arya Samaj would come and do a havan. Now, at one level, it was good because it doesn't really matter. No one's thinking about great questions about what is the truth of things or what is the basis of value. It's a cultural practice. It provides cultural grounding, gives a sense of security, family comes together, and so on and so forth. And that's perfectly fine. That has its place. No one is going to disagree with that. The problem often is that that kind of religion is also, if it is politicized, most likely to lead to some kind of violent or blind forms of devotion, right? The extreme of this, you would think of the Crusades, or you can think of, religious persecution, questions of untouchability, and so on and so forth, where blind superstitions, which would otherwise seem quite harmless and benign when you're doing a havan at home, somehow on the public sphere, all added up together, lead to quite an ugly sight. So I had a similar experience when I started growing up and reading those texts, which is I started asking everyone in my family when I was younger, why are we doing this? Because the texts don't seem to be saying this, or the texts seem to be saying something different. And neither anyone in my family, nor unfortunately the Panditji from the Arya Samaj, seem to have any good answers. And usually you would be met with a rich harvest of moral platitudes, right? Now,
or this is how it's always been,
yeah.
that's the standard response I used to get.
Precisely. So that's just an unthinking call to tradition. And like I said, it's culturally secure, and I wouldn't want to take that away from anyone unless you have something better to give to them to replace that. Now, I think more and more people, as information is becoming freer, questions are becoming more stronger and fiercer. You are faced with these debates more often. It's more difficult to be insular. More and more people are going down this path of rationalist understanding. Now, the first pit stop in that journey is, it was for me, like it is for you and most people, is a rejection of religion, because what you see of religion seems to make no sense. But I think, at least for me, once you dig a little bit deeper, you seem to realize that there are two ways of reforming religion. One is this attack from outside, whether it's a political attack or a scientific attack. So it's like a tag team against religion. But the second is a reform from within, which is the kind that Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo advocated, which is a rationalist critique of religion, so that you can discover those deepest truths in it. There's a very interesting description of this, which is that true religion or spirituality is not anti-rational, it's supra-rational. It's beyond reason. There are things to know in this world which cannot be known through reason. Ordinary religion is often infra-rational, which is that it hasn't yet gone through that anxiety and rigor of rational questioning. And what we need to do is to go forth and forward with as many rationalist critiques of religion as we can. But in doing that, also open ourselves to the door that, like you said, in our daily practices, that there is a space for silence, there is a space for something beyond reason, beyond the senses, which is really the core philosophical beginning point of, at least in my understanding, the traditions that I am familiar with, the Vedantic tradition. That's really where the self-discovery and seeking begins to happen. So I think that kind of cultural reform from within, rather than a complete abandonment of religion, is one alternative that people can employ and think about in their lives. Because ultimately, we need some source of value as human beings. You can get it from literature, you get it from poetry, you get it from religion. After a while, these categories don't make much sense, right? So we have to get it from somewhere. And the argument that I see, the practical, pragmatic argument is, why not utilize some wonderful cultural resources that we have and take, in a sense, the easy path of the path of least resistance of internal reform, rather than going through a very difficult and hardened route that the West has had to go through with this antagonism between religion and science and reason and faith, which has had all sorts of difficult political implications that we see even till today.
Yeah, and I think that this actually segues nicely with what the Karnataka High Court was trying to do, because in a sense, for me, I read the judgment as trying to make religion invisible in the public sphere, right? As in, it's a different matter, and I don't want to stress on this too much, that what you were looking at is a particular item of clothing from a particular religion, and a lot has been written about that, and I don't think that fits in with the discussion that we are having right now. But the core idea was one of trying to make religion invisible in the public sphere, and that seems to be the kind of thinking that you said that that some of the aversions that your students have, as in it would be the sequitur of those aversions, is that let's not talk about these things at all, and let's keep it private. But as you said, and I completely endorse this, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It will mean that religion will come out in ways in which perhaps we don't anticipate, given that there is some value that core religion has. So it will come out in certain ways, and it will take certain forms which will be which may be extremely unpleasant. And this is not for a moment to say that the Karnataka High Court was right or wrong, but I think the approach was to try and make religion invisible. It was particularly unfortunate that it was to make minority religions invisible, because there's a lot of political connotations around that. But here's the question that comes out of that, is that if we were to take an alternative approach, okay, which is what Raag, you and I were trying to do in that article that we wrote, is that we can have a celebration of religion in the public sphere. Now, how do you see that as consistent with an understanding of secularism, that we agree that the country is part of the basic structure of our constitution?
Right. So that's a difficult question. I'll perhaps offer two thoughts. So, but before that, I just want to make one point, because as I was telling you before this interview began, or before this
Don't think it's
discussion
an
began.
interview.
Sorry. Yeah, so it felt like that before this discussion began. I've been on the defensive. Yeah. After we wrote that piece in the Times of India, there was all sorts of name calling and just unhelpful comments. The question was not that people disagreed, but that there was very little space to have this dialogue. And I think no matter where we stand, and I happen to disagree with the Karnataka High Court judgment, but I don't think that the judges are ill-intentioned or that the judges have done anything other than offer a reasonable version of the argument that they thought best fit in this position. I happen to
No, but then
disagree.
let me make this question simpler, because while there were a lot of name calling, and that tends to happen whenever someone writes something, but there was also a response written to our piece by Minhas Merchant, as in it was not name calling, as in it was primarily about the fact, and the main argument that he seemed to be making was the fact that if you are secular as a country, then you cannot in any way have religion in the public sphere. Okay, so you cannot have hijab in the public sphere, you cannot have saffron shawls in the public sphere. This is a question of a school or a college which has to have a uniform, and a uniform public sphere is the way to a secular India. How
Yes.
would you respond to a reasonably fair criticism of this nature, which is a way in which a lot of people understand secularism?
Right. So I think the answer to that lies in understanding first what is the public sphere, because it's quite a vague expression. So you have a governmental public sphere, which is, electoral politics, which is what members of parliament do, members of legislative assemblies do, what people in local government do. Now, in that governmental public sphere, obviously, it is not a good argument to say that I think X policy is fine because Y religion says it. So you can't have political authorities aligning with any particular religious beliefs. That's simply not admissible. You need to demonstrate the reasonableness and the validity of your argument to everyone, religious or otherwise. So that public sphere does not have any religion in it. And that's what I refer to earlier as political secularism. Now, then you have all sorts of other public spheres, right? You have the marketplace, you have schools, universities, colleges, cinemas, workplaces. This is where we live our lives outside our homes. This is a place where we make friends. It is a part of our identity. It's where we carry ourselves. Now, in that public sphere, I think we can have a vibrancy of religious activity, and the state can ensure that that vibrancy of religious activity operates within liberal principles to make sure that no one is harming anyone else, that there is no unreasonable demands being made upon any other community. But short of that kind of role as a referee, I don't see why religion in the public sphere there is a cause for anxiety, as the Karnataka High Court or Mr. Merchant said, but can also perhaps be a cause for celebration of our diversity, where we are not just somehow tolerating another religion, but we are comfortable with it, we're mingling with it, and we can embrace the diversity and embrace the difference rather than be scared of it. I also quickly, perhaps, because I just want to provide some historical background, there was a very interesting, perhaps controversial sociologist, T.N. Madan, who had argued, against perhaps the idea of secularism that we're discussing right now. And writing back in 1987, when there were a lot of, which is sort of the last time when a lot of these problems were being debated as deeply as they are right now in the public sphere, he had made the following remark that, and he was speaking about Jawaharlal Nehru, and he said the following. He said that contrary to the expectations of a rationalist social science, economic growth and the breakdown of previous social relations has not led to the denial of religion, but rather has led to the revival of religious identities, right? So the question for him was not how do you avoid or ignore religion and by relegating it to the private sphere, because that's simply not working. The Indian people, as a matter of each person's democratic choice, are religious, but rather to say, how do these religious and secular identities mingle in the public sphere, rather than driving a wedge down the middle and saying religious identity at home, secular identity at the workplace. That seems to be a suboptimal solution. So I think Professor Madan got the question right. His answers I don't necessarily agree with, but we need to figure out how we can be religiously liberal rather than asking people to necessarily make that choice. And that, I think, is where India as a Dr. Radhakrishnan had this very interesting, famous remark. I don't know if he was speaking humorously, but he used to say that India is a small laboratory where all the experiments of racial and religious synthesis can be undertaken in the world. So we have a bit of everything, and our job to the world, our service to the world, is to figure out how to make a sense of some kind of a peaceful, coexistent, harmonious sense of this khichdi that we have. So the question is to do that, I think.
Yeah, so, and I think the way in which I first encountered this khichdi, and this is perhaps true for everybody, is perhaps in our schools. As in, I went to going back to our biographical detour, I went to a missionary school where in all functions, as in there would be a reading from the Gita, reading from the Bible, a reading from the Quran, sometimes from the Guru Granth Sahib. There would be a Christian hymn, and then there would be a Hindu devotional hymn. So there was this kind of, I would say that, well, maybe it was a celebration. Sometimes it felt a bit tokenistic. We used to say that, oh, here we go again. It's the same thing that, I mean, I guess there was something in that when we said that it was the same thing that all four people are going to say in various languages. But I think that what is the question that always struck me is that how can this celebration be real? Okay, because in some sense there is a certain, I don't want to belittle the importance of those four hymns being sung, right? Because I think somewhere the four hymns being sung was also a testament to the fact that this is who we are, as in whether we like it or not, as in because whatever, it could go home sooner, but it would have to be accepted that this is who we are. Maybe there is a role there, but how do we transcend sort of more symbolic expressions of this celebration to try and make sure that we go from sort of more passive words like tolerance and acceptance to embracing a kind of diversity? And I think that's the question that I want to ask you, because the Karnataka High Court also used this interesting word of qualified public spaces. Like these are public spaces where there needs to be some degree of uniformity, but how do we embrace diversity in these kinds of qualified public spaces?
So I think this is a question for each of us, educators, young adults, children, parents, employers, employees, businessmen, for everyone to think about and to embody in their own little micro environments, rather than this being some kind of large constitutional question that has a single answer that we're going to get from the Karnataka High Court or the Supreme Court. I think the moment we do that, we have given up a large amount of cultural power away from local communities, and that will really be a sad state of affairs. So what can we do? I can perhaps only speak biographically. What I've noticed often is tokenism, while it's well-intentioned, is often a kind of disguised politics where you are afraid of saying what you want to say openly. And so you try and sort of skirt around the issue and employ all manners of suggestiveness without saying it openly. I would encourage, and I try to do this in my teaching practices, my students may be able to verify this, is to speak about the issue openly, to embrace diversity of opinion, to not hide behind a facade of neutrality necessarily, but to say that there are differences, there are diversities, and that doesn't mean that we are lesser off for it or that we should be scared about it, but that is rather an invitation to more dialogue. So practically, for example, in a school or a university, it would be interesting to have cultural exhibitions from different religious traditions, musical expressions from different religious traditions. There are great traditions of art that we find in the great faiths, and they could be welcomed there without anyone feeling as though it is some kind of an imposition into a qualified public space. Yes, there are obviously limitations in certain public spaces, and I fully agree with the Karnataka High Court that there is some qualification required, but qualification does not mean a complete abandonment. There is a big daylight between those two things. So that, I think, is something that's really important. So let me just end, for example, with one final remark. So because this came up in a class that I was teaching. So it was a class on political theory, and we were considering the views of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. And if you go back to their political theories, you will often find that they draw or engage quite liberally with Christian theological debates. Now, I don't think that makes them any lesser political philosophers. If anything, it adds more context and culture to what they are saying. And so engaging with that debate, no matter what conclusion you reach, but at least entering that debate is extremely important. And in workplaces, we can celebrate different festivals like we do with our national holidays without anyone feeling as though they are left out or anyone feeling as though there is some kind of an intrusion by one community or another.
Yeah, I think holidays are so particularly self-serving that even if the feeling of intrusion is there, that would be outweighed by the feeling of laziness of having a holiday. But let's come full circle back to one issue about
Although,
the
can I
hijab.
just say one thing? So there was a very interesting anecdote that a colleague of mine told me. So they were in school. There was a girl from a Muslim family, and she was given a special dispensation to wear a hijab. This is many, many years ago, and this is in a smaller part of the rural part of the country. So there was not much politics, and there was no political situation there. And it's very interesting. This was in, I think, 4th or 5th grade. And the children in 4th or 5th grade, when they saw this young girl, their first remark was about how beautiful she looked and how her dress was so pretty. And they also wanted to all dress up. And so it was a very innocent and nice reaction to an account of religious expression, obviously assuming that the girl is not being forced to do this or anything of that sort. And I think that if I can just make a small remark in defense of innocence, especially in universities and colleges, I think small little interactions and engagements of that kind added up will go a long way towards having a slightly calmer, more sane public sphere where we aren't so scared and there isn't this constant tension about the politicization of what you say.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that's beautifully put. That we need to be able to say more than a word in defense of innocence, and in terms of just simple human feelings that come across in interactions between two human beings, irrespective of any of the other identities that are used to describe us. And I think, well, this might be a slightly complicated way to put it, so that one of the ways in which the state or the system tries to ensure that we are seen as equal human beings rather than by our different identities is through uniforms in schools, right? As in, I think uniforms in some sense is seen as trying to do away with the differentiations that exist to a certain extent. And that's the idea, right? The word itself is revealing. And one of the genuine, very bona fide feedback that we received on the article about the hijab was the fact that we were always open to having uniforms in school, right? As in, and a uniform in school necessarily entails a certain uniformity. As in, and I think that kind of goes with the term itself. And whatever it may be, whether it's a hijab or it's a ring that someone wants to wear or a sacred thread, or it need not even be religious. It could be something that a kind of different kind of hairstyle. Whatever that is, as it militates against that uniformity. And given that this is a qualified public space, what's wrong with saying that if you're in the school, you have to wear this uniform? Do you think that there's anything particularly troubling about that kind of sentiment?
Absolutely not. I'm completely in agreement with that. I would just make two qualifying remarks. The first is that I think this is not a constitutional question. This is not a question for judges. This is a question for educators to decide based on the circumstances of the school that they find themselves in. And I don't think there is a single answer for all schools in India or Karnataka or even perhaps a city. Each school is run differently. They are connected to the community, and they will have the liberty. Educators should have the liberty and the wisdom to decide what works best for them. The second caveat, again, this is a pedagogical remark. This is not some political or constitutional remark, is the debate is not whether we will have complete uniformity through uniforms, or whether it's everything goes and there is a slippery slope and people will come wearing whatever they like and there will be some kind of expressive anarchy, religious or otherwise. And I can understand as an educator why we would have anxieties about that. As on a lighter side, my concern at the National Law School is less with hijabs, but more with people turning up in their night suits. That I think is a more pedagogically worrisome fact. But I think if we as educators reflected and thought about how we can, within the bounds of having uniforms, welcome diversity, whether it's through allowing people to wear something on their body that is compatible with the uniform, or working it into extracurricular activities, into outside school activities, introducing them, like you said, to different texts. There are a whole different set of innovative and interesting ways to introduce students to diversity. And that actually, I think, is something the Karnataka High Court, I am quite sure, if we were to speak with the judges, would be absolutely in consonance with. So I don't think there is that much of a divide as is being portrayed. There is a lot of common ground where educators can come together and think of interesting, innovative ways to find common solutions.
And I think in law, perhaps the doctrinal term to describe that would be reasonable accommodation. I'm not a big fan of that term. I genuinely think that it's more in terms of respecting difference and celebrating diversity, because that is at the end of the day not only the core of religion, it's the core of Indic thought, and it's the core of what I think the Constitution envisages as this country. So I think that there needs to be a genuine celebration and embracing of that diversity, rather than merely token ways of doing it, or just accommodating somebody, because it's really not about accommodation, it's about respect and celebration. So Raag, I think we leave it here. We've shot. I wasn't looking at the clock, so I think we went over by quite a bit. But I think it was an engrossing conversation, and I think it's particularly important for lawyers and law students perhaps to understand that constitutional questions are not decided in a vacuum, and in this non-vacuum in which it is decided, it's not just politics, but there is a lot of context, and that context could sometimes be pure religion, it could be philosophy, but I think the bottom line is that context must be understood, and this beautiful world of Indic philosophy, which I must admit, as I have come to very late in the day, is one that I would urge everybody to explore. And Raag, would you like to say something to end it?
No, it was wonderful to have this conversation, and I actually wanted to ask you some questions about constitutional secularism.
Sure, why don't you do that, and then we'll end it after that.
I actually had one core question, which is that I was just browsing through the Constituent Assembly debates, and I expected when I went in that I would find a lot of fiery opinions and deep debates and questions about what exactly is religion and the place of religion. And I confess that I didn't find that kind of a very engaged debate that I thought one would see. I don't know if it's because of the partition or because they said that this is a question that we're going to leave on the side. But in a lot of our debates, we've been attributing positions to the Constitution. And my question to you is, do you think the Constitution has clear answers for us or guidance for us on this? Or is this a question that we need to now think about with the best resources that we have today?
Well, yeah, I think when Elena Kagan was the Solicitor General of the United States, and when Chief Justice Roberts asked her a question, she responded with another question. And to that, Chief Justice Roberts said that usually the questions go the other way. And I think this is what's happened here a little bit, but being put on the spot, I think the short answer to your question is that the Constitution does go some distance towards answering some of the questions that have arisen recently, particularly on account of the hijab controversy. What does the Constitution say? The Constitution says broadly four things as far as religious freedoms are concerned. First, as far as this individual question that we were discussing, the individual aspect of religion, it says that every individual has the freedom to preach, practice, and propagate his or her own religion. That's the core freedom that exists. Number two is that it recognizes the fact that religion is also an organized group activity. And given the fact that it's an organized group activity, particularly keeping in mind all the mutts, the various sects of, particularly the various sects within the Hindu religion, but also autonomous institutions within the Islamic realm and the various churches that exist in Christianity, there is a group right given to religious groups to manage their own affairs. So a certain degree of autonomy is provided for. Third, it says that the state, what can the state do or not do? This is what you called political secularism. Broadly, the state cannot discriminate against anyone on the ground of their religion. And the fourth, there's a special right given to minorities to ensure that they can run educational institutions and also preserve their language and script of choice. Okay. Broadly, these are the four things that the Constitution does. Now, are these remarkable? Not really, because this is classic liberalism, right? This is what we understand liberalism to mean and religious liberty to mean, and the Constitution in its fundamental rights chapter is heavily borrowing from an Anglo-American tradition of what religious liberty means. So the fact about the state not discriminating, the fact about the individuals having the freedom to practice, preach, and propagate religion, as it is well established in constitutional thought for over 200 years. In reference to the Indian condition, it adds this group right, which is sort of a recognition of the reality in India, and also minority protection, which is taken at that point of time to be critical to understanding the kind of nation that we are trying to create. So I think to that extent, it does check all the boxes. But do the Constituent Assembly debates show a deep understanding of the place of religion in our lives? Perhaps no. And I think there are two factors to this. The first is a very pragmatic one, which is time. 3 years is a very short time to draft a constitution. And they've done a Herculean task to get this document together in that period of time. So 3 years doesn't really allow deep philosophical debates on subjects. But second also is that when you read the debates, you'll understand that there is a fair degree of understanding that religion does play a very important role in the lives of Indians. And I think there is an understanding, it's kind of unstated in places, implicit, but there is an understanding that religion is important. So I think that kind of forecloses any further question in terms of what do we mean by religion being important, what kind of religion. And so I've always been pretty surprised by this, that on one hand, there is this acceptance that religion is important. And on the other hand, as in we are saying, as in though not saying it in those words, but we are saying that like India is secular without necessarily diving deeper into these, because obviously this is where we've ended up, right? Because we've said that we are secular and we understand ourselves as secular. There is a pretty dominant stream of thought which says that secular is irreligious, and that is exactly contrary to what the Constituent Assembly and the framers of the Constitution meant. So I think that the short answer to your question is that the Constitution is clear in terms of what it means by religious protection. It could have gone much deeper into understanding what religion means vis-a-vis the secular state that we are setting up, and made it clearer, because it's kind of implicit, that secularism does not mean irreligiosity. Secularism does not mean religion is only in the private sphere. Secularism means that the state shall not establish a religion, the state shall not discriminate against someone on the basis of religion. It does not mean that religion ceases to be important or ceases to be visible in the public sphere. And I think a lot more could have been done in the constitution, and I think that might have solved some problems that we have. It might have created some others, I don't know, but I think that it did some basics. I think it could do a lot more.
Thanks, Arghya. I wish we could have this conversation for longer, but I think this is hopefully the beginning of answering several of these questions. So the next 10, 15 years are going to be an interesting time to see how.
I hope so. And I think that as a constitutional law scholar, as in the constitution is never static. And I think it's incumbent on everyone who thinks deeply on these issues to engage with issues on religion and not treat it purely as a matter in the private sphere. Because I think, as you said, the 10, 15 years to come will be a time of intellectual exposition, but it will also be a time of political upheaval. And a lot of political upheaval will be on the grounds of religion. And I think it's very important for anyone who carries who has a place for religion in their minds and hearts to think and engage deeply with these issues. So thanks very much, Raag. It was a real pleasure talking to you, and hopefully this is the continuation of a conversation and not the culmination.
Thanks, Arghya. It was lovely to be on.
It's time for CLATTR, our weekly legal quiz. Last week, I'd asked you to identify the connection between a sculpture by William Benz in Trafalgar Square and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The answer, which many of you got right, is Sir Henry Havelock. Havelock, who was a British general, had an island named after him, the Havelock Island in the Andamans, and also has its sculpture in Trafalgar Square. Havelock Island, as you might know now, has been renamed the Swaraj Island. The winner is Prashant Nagraj. Many congratulations, Prashant. A free subscription of Disney+Hotstar is on its way to you. This week, our question is on the hijab. In 2006, the House of Lords ruled that a student of a school which allowed the hijab as part of its uniform could not claim the right to also wear a jilbab. That's a full body garment in the school. What is the name of this seminal judgment from the House of Lords? This is an easy one for law students, so do write in with your answers to justify@vidhilegalpolicy.in, or right answers stand a chance to win an exciting gift. Today, since we dealt with Indian secularism and diversity, there's only one song that really captures it, Jana Gana Mana. Hear it in the voice of Rabindranath Tagore, the master whose birth anniversary we're celebrating this week. Thank you for listening. Adjourn.
Jana Gana Mana Adhinayaka Jaya He Bharat Bhagya Vidhata Punjab Sindh Gujarat Maratha Dravida Utkala Banga Vindhya Himachal Jamuna Ganga Uttala Jaladhitaranga Tab Shubha Name Jage Tab Shubha Ashish Mage Gahe Tab Jaya Gatha Jana Gana Mangala Dayaka Jaya He Bharat Bhagya Vidhata Jaya He Jaya He Jaya He.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, follow us on Twitter at Vidhi_India for regular updates. We are on SoundCloud and Spotify as Vidhi Center for Legal Policies podcast. You can also listen to us on Google Podcasts or iTunes. Email us at justify@vidhilegalpolicy.in to share your comments and feedback on this episode.